Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today at Collective Liberation. We're going to just hang out here for a second while folks enter the room. We're incredibly grateful that everybody was able to join us today. My name is Stacey Mann. I'm one of the organizers of today's conference. I work with both Museums and Race and Empathetic Museum, and have been really grateful just for the work that's gone into the sessions and the planning for the next few days. And we're just really grateful that everybody's here to participate. We also wanted to say a quick thank you to Scott and to Tara, who are providing our signing services today, and really appreciate them being here as well. So before we get started, oops, wrong way. Before we get started, we wanted to just pause for a moment of reflection. When we're working at different conferences, we usually collaborate with local Indigenous communities to help develop a local land acknowledgement specific to the location where we are. This year, because we're joined by people from so many different places, we ask that you instead take a moment to reflect on the history, social circumstances, and personal experiences that bring us to this moment. We ask you to consider whose ancestral home you occupy, and also what circumstances brought you to this moment, and how you carry your ancestors with you to today. So we're just going to take a few seconds to think about that. Okay, thank you for that. Again, we are really grateful that everyone has been able to join us today. And we wanted to give everyone a quick sneak peek of the conference as it's laid out over the next few days. Obviously, you're with us today. We hope you'll be able to join us for some of the other sessions later today, and then again tomorrow and Friday. In addition, we're also introducing this year an Ask and Offer resource for folks to share the needs they may have, or if they have experiences or resources that they have to offer. We're hoping that folks can use this as a way of connecting with one another in the coming days. And I'll be sharing a link to that resource in the chat in a few minutes. And so without any further delay, I want to introduce Adriel Luis, who is going to be presenting about Bigger Than the Internet, Museums and the Digital Colonization of the Web.
Hello, hello. Hi, folks. Ooh, I kind of hear myself. Oh, you know why? See, trying to be all techie. I'm also signed on my iPad. There we go. Can y'all hear me all right? Can you sort of just like pop in some ones in the chat if you can hear? If you can yeah, that's the blup blup on Zoom. So yeah, I hope that today can be a bit of a cipher. So you know, feel free to drop in the chat. Like I said, I got stuff on, so I can see all of y'all while we'll speaking. I'm tuning in from Sangna, SAANGNA. This is the land of Tongfa people, Quiche people, Gabrielino, and right at the border of Chumash. Out here, they call it Venice, California. I'm so grateful to be here. I've been here since the beginning of the pandemic, and one of the one of the most beautiful experiences I've had in the last couple of weeks was meeting a storyteller named L. Frank Manriquez, um, who talks about the Tongva history of this Los Angeles area and the understanding of this world as one that was um, really created as a collective um, as a collective concept uh, to hold human beings, to nurture us, so that we can nurture those beings back. And when we talk about beings, this is of course the plants and the animals, but also the minerals, the waterways, the air, the bacterium in our gut, all that. We're just surrounded by so much life. And so even though so many of us have been calling this an era of isolation or quarantine, I really see this as an era of recognition of just so much of the amazingness that exists around us, that for me personally, because I've been zipping around traveling a lot over the last few years, I really hadn't taken the time to pay attention to. So I just want to honor all of you. I know that where the sun's coming out, fools getting quarantined, I'm getting vaccinated, and Zoom fatigue is at a peak high. So uh, for you to join on a hump day, on a morning or afternoon or wherever you're tuning in from. I do not take that for granted whatsoever. So just want to take a moment to honor you. And yeah, I guess as we before we really kind of jump into this research, I really want to ground us in one more thing. So if you're however it is that you're tuning in, whether it's by your computer, a tablet, a phone, I invite you to join me in just paying attention to this device. Like we spend so much of our days looking at it, typing, tapping at it, poking it, and all of that. And so it's like, what do you mean pay attention to our device? But I really invite you to just kind of take a look at the surface of your device, sort of the edges, the buttons. Think about the gears, the chips inside. Um, and again, recognizing that all of this at some point came from some raw material. At some point, it was extracted from our environment by humans or machines, which were built by humans, which were also made of raw materials. Uh, Early in the pandemic, news broke that slave labor was being used to build iPhones, and we know that this is the case with so many of our devices in one way or another. And so, in the same way that we acknowledge the land that we exist on, and that we increase our attention to the deep history that oftentimes we neglect, I also want to, in the spirit of this conversation, give a moment to pay attention to just all of the environments that were extracted from, all of the human labor that went into these devices that we hold in our hands and we stare at all day, and that we get tired of, that we toss at the wall when we get mad, all that stuff, and just honor all that energy, and the energy that exists in just making the internet work, however, whatever it is that means. There's people working. There's climates being changed. There's so much that goes into it in order for us to have this conversation. And so moving forward in the next few minutes, as I share my research, I just want to hold that. I want to honor that, and again, also honor your time in this era of zoomed outedness. Sorry, Scott. I'm not sure what the sign is for zoomed outedness. All right. Are y'all ready to begin? If so, let's drop some ones. Let's drop some ones. And also feel free to just I know we'll do Q&A at the end, but feel free to pop in some questions, along the way. I'm going to share this research that I've been working on for the last few months that I'm so excited for you all to join me in. It's what I hope is the beginning of a larger conversation about collective liberation, and what we're talking about when we have this gathering. The reason why I felt like it was so appropriate to share this research with collective liberation is here we have, these groups of people, these organizations, shout out to Museums and Race, Mass Action, Museum Workers Speak, Death to Museum, Inclusium, Museums Are Not Neutral, Empathetic Museum, Visitors of Color. These folks just putting in their time and their energy to make these conversations happen in ways that otherwise would not. Is such a gift. It's such a gift, and to have a platform to be able to share some writing that I've been doing over the last few months is also just such a gift. When I think about collective liberation, again, I'm thinking about this idea of Tongva existence that I've just begun learning over the last year, living out here in LA, and also thinking about my own ancestry. Thank you, Stacey, for that call. My family comes from Toisan in southern China. They migrated through Hong Kong, Mexico, and eventually over to Turtle Island out here. I was born and raised on Ohlone land in the Bay Area. And so one of the things I've been doing during this past year is just like reading creation stories, Chinese creation stories. And, one of the earliest stories is of Pangu, who is sort of creator essence. And there's some commonalities with the Tongfa story of beginning, where what we understand maybe from Western knowledge as a god is really just like the life and the breath of all the existence around us. And as we recognize that we're a part of it, we are not simply here to be served by it or to simply serve it, but for there to really be this mutual exchange. What Robin Wall Kimmerer calls a mutual flourishing is something that I've held the entire time I've been writing this, and that I know that all of us are interested in learning more about, given that we're here with a session of collective liberation. So with that said, I'm gonna share the screen. Basically drop this research, and here, let me also type in the link in case you would like to read along with me. Boom. So if I get, see all your little anonymous animal emoji icons on that Google Doc, that make me also feel quite seen. I appreciate all of y'all. Wonderful, wonderful. Hello, Lemur. Hello, anonymous Norwal. I see you. All right, cool. So this paper is yours to read. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll read excerpts of it, and I'll talk through it a little bit. But I invite you to spend some time with it. It's a bit long, but I hope it's something that you do enjoy. But I'll go ahead and share the screen now. Cool. Yeah, I appreciate all of y'all for joining me for Bigger Than the Internet, Museums and the Digital Colonization of the Web. This is what I hope to be the beginning of a larger conversation around, how can museums be stewards of history, art, and culture online in a way that is responsible, in a way that holds us in our communities and does well for us. What does that all mean? We'll unpack that a little bit throughout the next hour. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of the things that we're going to be covering today, here is our agenda. I'll be reading about like a 10-minute excerpt of like the second part of this paper. It's called Decolonize or Nah. After that, we'll do some decolonial shout outs, take you on a little tour through Facebook hell, And then at that point, probably take a little break, like a little 3-4 minute break. And then I hope you stick around and join me for some internet ethics pro tips. We'll basically talk about some ideas, some budding ideas around like what does it really mean to shift museums and institutions and the work that we do in museums towards collective liberation. If we have time, we'll do like a terms of service clinic, and then we'll have a cipher. I know like a lot of this is like encoded, but I promise it'll all make sense. It'll all make sense quite soon. Word up, word up. So while I'm sharing the screen, it's kind of difficult for me to see the chat. And so, just forgive me. I'll keep on kind of checking back and forth every once in a while as I can. But I'm trusting that folks can hear me if or see me if I'm just like asking you again to drop some ones. If you're with me, are you ready to just kind of tune in for like 10 minutes while I read a little bit? Cool. Thank you, y'all. Oh, here we go. Boom. Little chat box on the side. Boom. Okay. Yeah. Oop. Okay. So you can also read along on the screen over here. Sometimes I like to do these readings like this so folks can read along. All right, decolonize or nah. I fucking love the internet. It's how I reach my best friends, discover my favorite songs, and encounter art that profoundly impacts me. It's where I first learned to care about social issues and to organize around them. It's why I acquired skills to build a career as an artist, a web designer, and eventually a curator. When the internet is at its best, it's an incredibly inspiring, wildly hilarious, deeply sensitive, and uniquely nurturing space where ideas breed culture and culture breeds ideas. I love how writer and curator Anurita Vikram puts it. The internet is a tool that allows us to find one another, link arguments, dig up buried truths, empower words, be visible, and downright rabble rouse when read. We built a community through it. How something born of a US Department of Defense program could become a vehicle for activists to resist industrial development on Standing Rock and Mauna Kea, while also serving as the venue for QAnon conspiracy theorists to organize an insurrection in the United States Capitol, signifies the seismic impact of the internet on our lives on and offline. It is a realm of possibilities and paradoxes, a source of agency and apathy, and as with most things of great value, it is at the center of epic power struggles. As curator of digital and emerging practice at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, my relationship with the internet could be described as ambiguous, even haphazard. Is the internet a medium to be collected and researched as one would curate 18th century ceramics and Cubist paintings? Is it a venue for staging and promoting exhibitions and content? Or is it in fact me, you, all of us, an expression of the life force that permeates humans and our thoughts and our cultures? Similar questions line my relationship with Asian American life and community organizing, which are also concepts that I research while intimately identifying with and caring about. Museums, curation, and the researcher-subject divide are all byproducts of colonialism. Historically, museums were social platforms for establishing influence as empires grew and accumulated followers, in part by defining expertise at the pleasures of their respective conquerors. In contrast, the notion of the curator as the researcher of the subject, while also intertwined with the subject, while also existing as the subject itself, recognizes a universal interconnectedness that is central to many of our ancestral ways of knowing, including my own, which is rooted in Toisan, southern China. It honors what environmental scientist and scholar of indigenous knowledge, Robin Wall Kimmerer, calls an ethical habitat for coexistence and mutual flourishing, a time when the intellectual monoculture of science will be replaced with a polyculture of complementary knowledge. So, what Robin's talking about here, this mutual flourishing, this complementary knowledge. I just love these terms. I think that they really speak to my understanding of collective liberation as we sort of unpack that topic throughout the next couple of days with this session. But this ancient orientation has been long overshadowed by Western modernity, which, as poet and philosopher Bayo Kamalafe describes, as centralizes rationality and human experiences and instrumentalizes the non-human world as resources for human ends. Modernity separates the self and the other, effectively defining knowledge as the dominion of the knower over the knowable. As Linda Tahiwai Smith, scholar of Indigenous education, explains, Western systems of classification and representation enable different traditions or fragments of traditions to be retrieved and reformulated, to be played out in systems of power and domination with real material consequences for colonized peoples. Yet, embodied, interconnected knowledge has survived and thrived in marginalized spaces, but pivotal arenas such as the Black arts movement, the Hawaiian Renaissances, the disability justice movement, ethnic studies, and decades of Indigenous-led scholarship on decolonizing research. Integral to unraveling of colonization, explains Maori studies scholar Jolie Seed Pihama, is our own ancestral wisdom, which can only be found in our stories. This personally invested, community-centered, socially driven approach to research and curating is a form of culture bearing that has recently shaken institutions in unprecedented ways, forcing museums worldwide to seriously investigate what it means to, quote, decolonize for the sake of their reputations and survival. In 2019, the International Council of Museums plans to update the definition of museums was curtailed by disagreements over including language about, quote, human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. In 2020, the American Alliance of Museums published a list of decolonization resources on its website, which you can only get to behind a $90 paywall. But can museums truly decolonize while remaining museums at their core? According to Smith, decolonization, once viewed as the formal process of handing over instruments of governments, is now recognized as a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power. Mentionable steps museums have taken include repatriation of stolen objects, opening programs with native land acknowledgements, and removing monuments that celebrate colonial expansion. But decolonization demands more than atonement for grievances of the past. As Seed Bahama explains, a decolonial research agenda demands not only a revealing of the impact of colonization, but a focus on unraveling it. Decolonization must include a concerted, sustained commitment to rejecting existing colonial practices and frameworks. It must entail a strategic, valiant transmutation towards honoring and being led by indigenous, enduring wisdom about who we are in relation to each other, our surroundings, and the lives we lead. It must be bigger than museums. While conversations about decolonizing the museum have focused on historical colonial violences, there's still so much to be discussed about institutions' participation and complicity to an online landscape that increasingly treats personal information as commodity. Data collection itself is not a colonial practice, but it is when it's done through harmful extraction methods, and even more so when the extraction is powered by systems built for profit and gain. As I write this article in 2021, museums throughout the world are making commitments in response to public demands for more just and equitable practices. Meanwhile, museums continue to measure their success in large part by their ability to incentivize people to engage with online platforms that are known to actively surveil and document their information in order to sell it to advertisers, governments, and miscellaneous parties. The fact that communities must pressure institutions for equity by means that put these very communities in danger of further exploitation illustrates what educator Suniti Rikkari describes as the double bind of representation, which has to fight against but also operate within the four walls of existing media practices. Museum staff and even entire departments are dedicated to growing online presence and social media influence, usually without guidance on the ethics and long-term implications of this growth on individuals or society. People who museums encourage to enter or remain on these platforms are exposed to a rapid rise in misinformation, hateful and violent speech, privacy violating advertising technologies, and security vulnerabilities, all of which museums claim no responsibility for. Their privacy policies defer responsibility to the social media platforms that host their content. This kind of thin disassociation is how museums historically justified their complicity in colonization, once viewed as only empire adjacent because they didn't commit the pillage, they just took in the booty. But just because a museum is not extracting tactile objects from physical terrain doesn't mean that it's no longer contributing to colonization. By ushering people and their data into a handful of mostly US operated channels, museums are actively participants in digital colonialism, which, according to sociologist Michael Quet, exercises economic domination through corporate colonization, imposes imperial control through architectural domination, casts the shadow of global surveillance capitalism over the world, and is expanding imperial state surveillance. So if museums are to seriously consider the paradox of decolonizing itself, it must recognize that the museum is not merely a passive fixture on the internet, just as it is not a passive recipient of the land it occupies and the collections it holds. As interest in decolonial thought grows, cautions writer Samaya Kasim, we must be aware of museums and other institutions' propensity to collect and exhibit because there is a danger that the museums will exhibit decoloniality in much the same way they displayed Black and brown bodies as part of the empire's collection. It therefore runs against well-intentioned gestures from the museum to uplift historically oppressed peoples when it prioritizes impressions, views, hits, and analytics over public safety, privacy, open exchange, and the well-being of all life. We must understand that the internet is not a static, invulnerable stage for accumulating an audience, but an ecosystem whose life and breath is impacted by our actions, whether we acknowledge our place in this ecosystem or not. All right, thanks, y'all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Hope that wasn't too bad. That's the most academic reading I'm gonna do all hour. Hold on, I need to turn the sound on. So I'm gonna unshare and then reshare again real quick. All right, cool. I'm gonna take a moment to like read the chats a bit. So I'm gonna just play like a minute of this, and then we'll go into some convo. All right. Well, first of all, can we give a shout out to the ASL interpreters? I appreciate y'all. Thank you so much. Thank you for making this accessible, as widely accessible as we possibly can. Really appreciate y'all. So why did I start with this most deaf track? This oh, hello. Hi there. So this paper, I wrote it as a combination of personal narrative, research. As you heard in the intro, I cite as many, a breadth of scholars. So I do include some academics, Western academics and Western technologists, but I really try to frame my argument. I really try to squad up my references with indigenous thinkers, particularly women of color, artists, and that's really how I came up. Like I said, I grew up in the Bay Area, and in 1999, when Most Def's Black on Both Sides came out, I was right at this brink. I was coming of age. I was about to graduate high school. I was really getting deep into figuring out what kind of music I like listening to, what kind of art I was into. I was starting to learn about the political and social environment around me. And I was also just like starting to spend a lot of time on the internet, like a lot of us were, right? Like 500 hours free AOL, right? And so when I think about collective liberation, I think about growing up in hip hop, community organizing, and the internet, and how all three of those were bound together and continue to be bound together through a notion of free exchange, open exchange, um, the sharing of information on an equal ground, what I would later come to understand as liberatory sort of an education and knowledge. And so when I joined museums in 2013, I came with that in me. And a lot of how I open up this paper is about some of the inner work that I was doing, trying to figure this out, like working at the Smithsonian, this massive ivory tower, operating on the internet, something that had changed greatly over the 15, 20 years since I really began spending a whole bunch of time on the internet. And really trying to understand what it means to continue to do right by communities, even as the internet changes and even as my career brought me to an institutional level. So yeah, I wonder, I mean, for those of, oh, what's up, Omar? Uh, so I wonder for folks in the chats, if you don't mind popping in, I'm curious, like, just so I can kind of figure out, like the best way to kind of steward the rest of this conversation. Like, are you do you work in museums? Are you a fan of museums? I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but I'm curious, how many people work in museums? How many people are tuning in sort of from I'm curious. I know, like, I have some friends who are popping in maybe to their first museum conference, unconference thing ever. We got, we got Elizabeth out here as an educator at an art museum. We got a lot of museum workers, I'm sure, because of the framing of this whole retreat session coalition thing. Word up, word up. I mean, we have people from so many different walks of life, and one of the learning curves I felt like I had was that I didn't come from a traditional museums background. I grew up in an arts community where museums felt very abstract, even when I was like touring with my band, and we were gigging, we were going to music festivals and things like that. The museum just seemed like something that I was like, how do you even figure out how to get your work up there? What does it even mean to see a museum as something that can be actively a part of my life, aside from me just kind of showing up, looking at things, and then going, and I really hold that in all the work that I do. I think about the fact that so many of the people that I grew up with continue to sort of see museums as these really like abstract places, right? And so as museums start to pick up this language of community-centered, whoop-de-whoop, inclusive, this and that, I really, look at that critically and question it oftentimes. So going into sort of the next part of this presentation, we're going to do some decolonial shout outs. Like I said, this you have the link to this paper. I'll share it again later on. But really what this paper does that I wanted to highlight, at least for this session, is it quotes from thinkers from kind of throughout the spectrum, but is really held, like I said before, mostly by women of color. And so as opposed to kind of like reading more of my words, I really wanted to just kind of lead you through some of the main points by highlighting some of the incredible thinkers and scholars and imaginers and knowers that I brought up, that I bring up throughout the paper. So yeah, we'll do some decolonial shout outs. But I guess before we do the decolonial shout outs, I kind of want to start it off. I'm going to start it off with a colonial shout out, right? One colonial shout out and then a bunch of decolonial shout outs. The reason why I need to do a colonial shout out is because especially for folks who may not have really investigated the side of museums, it's like, what do we mean decolonize a museum? How colonial are museums, right? Especially the Smithsonian. I think, the Smithsonian, the reason why I continue to work there is because I love it there. It's, I think we do incredible work, but the history, like whenever I bring up the history of the Smithsonian's collections, people are shocked. They don't know. So colonial shout out to Charles Wilkes, who led the United States exploring expedition from 1838 to 1842 throughout the Pacific, throughout the Antarctic region, throughout the western coasts of what we now call the Americas, and went around taking shit, killing people, 80 murdered in Fiji. Shout out Charles Wilkes. Why do I bring this up? Because we're talking about data extraction, right? So I'll read you a clip from his logs, like his self-volunteering kind of like recollections of his time in Antarctica collecting specimens of Arctic birds that continue to be in the collections of the National Museum of Natural History. As we wanted a number of specimens, I commenced kicking them down the precipice and knocked on the heads of those which had the temerity to attack me. Charles Wilkes in Antarctica. Boom, shout out, blup, 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 right? So, not obviously not everything that was taken throughout the Wilkes expedition was done in such an extractive manner, but recognizing that they came back with 40 tons of objects left behind indigenous people and their villages demolished. And also wrote a thick book with a lot of really insulting comments about different people. This is the colonial history of my institution. And I think for those of you who work in museums and institutions, you may or may not have to dig too deep before you find the colonial history of yours. But specifically with the Smithsonian, because so many museums look to the Smithsonian as an example. So many people think about the Smithsonian as the archetype museum. So many people, when they think museum, they think Smithsonian. I think it's really important for us to talk about this history. I've done some digging, haven't found a whole lot of publishing, really any publishing from Smithsonian employees about the colonial history. And that's kind of one of the things I'm really interested in unpacking with this paper and a couple of other things I'm publishing in the future. So anyway, enough of Wilkes. Let's do some decolonial shout outs. Okay, cool. What's up, Nora? That's right. Got to stick together. All right, so what we're going to do is just kind of I want to share these folks with you because and what I'm also going to do in my research paper that I haven't done real quick. I have a references section that's sort of like the kind of, let me go to my table of contents real quick. So I have the references. It's a gang of references. And I put links in as many as I could, but I know that there's also more links I can add. And I think particularly with the folks I'm going to shout out, if you're interested in the things I'm talking about today, these are great places to also look to where folks have been doing this work for much longer than I have. So shout out to Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I've already acknowledged multiple times. And who I read earlier says, I envision a time when the intellectual monoculture of science will be replaced with a polyculture of complementary knowledge. That's hip hop, that's call and response, that's collective liberation. That's peer-to-peer sharing. That's the internet, the internet network that I came to know and love. And Anuradha Vikram, I feel like I mispronounced Anuradha's name earlier when I read, so I just want to correct that. Anuradha Vikram, the internet is a tool that allows us to find one another, link arguments, dig up buried truths, empower words, be visible, and downright rabble rouse when needed. We've built a community through it. So many of you in the chats and in the participant list, I know by handle, know by chat, know by maybe even Zoom call, but have not seen in person. And so I really do see the internet as a place of community that I love so much. Shout out to Anne Xiao Mina, who is a technologist and incredible writer who describes the internet as a sort of a digital public town square, but also talks about how, like any shared space, it's never neutral, right? So, like Latanya Autry and Mike Moraski, museums are not neutral, the internet is not neutral, it must have politics. Whoever controls the town square also controls how we experience day-to-day reality, and that power dynamic is shifting, especially, this was written in 2015, so think about how that resonates now. Shout out to Lana Lopesi, one of my favorite writers right now. This book, False Divides, really helped me set the tone for how I wrote this paper. This capitalistic grab bag approach, which underpins the race to monetize both digital devices and online technologies, mirrors the grab bag approach to colonization of the Moana. And so Lana is talking about the Moana as the Pacific region, the Pacific Islands, and talks about, you know, when we think about, you know, Hawaii, Aotearoa, you know, the Marshall Islands, Samoa, Tonga, so many of these islands, you know, the Moana has embodied, the Pacific Ocean has embodied this network of mutual exchange that has existed for so long. And so False Divides is a great book that talks about how the internet continues that form of networking. And Sunita Bakari, who I brought up earlier as well. And I'm glad to revisit this quote because I know so many of us and the organizers of collective liberation are doing this right now, right? We work in institutions and yet we work there to try and change them, to do our best to change them and to do our best to communicate that like the change is going to happen with or without you changing, right? And I think that when we're especially talking about like the internet, whether or not you work at a museum, the fact that I had to promote this talk on Instagram as my primary channel, knowing that you know, it's capturing data on me, I'm causing anybody who looks at and likes my posts to add more candy into the algorithm, you know, giving more cookies to the marketers. And that's this what Sunita Bakari is talking about when she talks about this double bind of representation, that you know, we're trying to fight within the system, we're trying to fight the system from within the system. And also, oh, Amelia S. Wong is like, this is one of the best papers I came across while writing this. This was written back in 2013 and is one of the earliest critical analyses of museums and the use of social media. And Amelia says, museums using social media to engender equality, diversity, and social justice must consider the ambiguous returns of this media and the ethical questions they raise for practice. She goes on to talk about how a lot of museums, they think that using social media is already activism because they've been up in this ivory tower for so long. They're like, oh, well, if I respond to DMs, now I'm being democratic. And so Amelia really does a great job talking about how, you know, that museums and institutions can't just rest on the fact that they've opened up a little bit and then start patting themselves in the back as like activists or leaders in equity. And then just a couple more. Of course, Linda Tahiwai Smith cannot really, it's really difficult to try and talk about decolonizing methodologies without her and her incredibly seminal book, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she really talks about decolonization specifically in context of academia and what it means to rethink or actually recall what knowledge truly is once we you know, divest it from the institutional knowledge that we've all come to know through Western education. And then lastly, to just kind of kick us into the next stage, you know, once again, Sunita Bakari, she says, ultimately, choices about new media are really choices about new ways of living and future directions a particular community wishes to take and the questions that must be asked about technology adoption. Use of new media should be allowed to show an alternative to hegemonic global narratives and corporate control over media production. So there's a lot in that. There's a lot in that, right? But essentially what Sunita is talking about, and in this paper, she's speaking specifically, not so much about museums, but more about indigenous communities, in this case in Australia, and new media, and sort of this push and pull of like a lot of indigenous communities being able to share their stories, being able to reach each other in ways that they hadn't before, but also recognizing one of the reasons why this outreach needs to happen in the first place. One of the reasons why you know, there had not been so many other existing platforms for these communities is because of the institutions and the corporate structures that you know, that built themselves by demolishing indigenous people all throughout the world. And so, you know, this is also an incredible paper. Again, it's all linked in the references. So yeah, blip, 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 shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. Yeah, how are y'all doing? Y'all doing all right? Let me know in the chat. I feel like I'm hearing my voice a lot, so I know that you are too. So what we'll do is we're gonna do a quick tour through Facebook Hell, and then we'll do a little break. Does that sound good? We could all use some breaks. I'll drink some water to sort of try to water down this coffee that I've got in my system. But we'll do this tour of Facebook Hell first. So I'm not on Facebook anymore. I took myself off in 2018, right around the Cambridge Analytica times. For those of you who may not be aware of what I'm talking about, at a certain point, continuing still, Facebook sells our information to all types of shady characters, including Cambridge Analytica, which is a think tank that specifically uses personal data to try to sway elections. And so when I deactivated my Facebook, how many of you have tried to do this before, or done so, or thought about it? I might, if you haven't, I might push you over the edge. So, mute me if you're not ready to get off of Facebook. Before, they keep on asking, are you sure? Are you sure? Look at all your friends though, right? And then finally they're like, okay, fine. You can leave Facebook, and if you'd like, you can download your data, right? Now, I'd always thought of my data as like, the first scene of Matrix. It was just like binary code. I'm like, how can anybody sift through my data, right? And so I downloaded the zip file, and I'm gonna show it to you. True exposure. All right, so these are the folders that organize my data on Facebook. And the part that I write about in Bigger Than the Internet is this file over here, entitled Advertisers. Hold on, we'll let this, there we go. Advertisers who uploaded a contact list with your information, right? Now, I have not gone on most of these pages. I do not know these people, al fresco, all natural, I was on Facebook already. I had already deliked as many pages as I could. I had already removed all the sort of hobby section things. I took off my phone number and email address. Like in the last few years of Facebook, I was really hardly on it. I was just kind of popping my head in to see what was going on, and then popping back out. But so advertisers who uploaded this isn't even people who have my contact information. This is people who have shared my contact information with others. We're only at D. I know, Lawrence. We're only at D. Hang on, I'm not going to scroll through the whole thing. Bloop. It just keeps on going. It just keeps on going. And so, that's and I'm under no illusion that this is not, part of the same server as Instagram and WhatsApp. And so I have not liberated myself from the Zuckerberg universe, the Facebook hell, but it was very illuminating. It gave me a lot of insight into sort of like really just how this stuff works. I think so many of us are learning that the conversation of internet privacy can't just go as far as being like, well, I've got nothing to hide, or, well, nobody would really want to know anything about me anyway. Oh, J. Cole, it's fine for J. Cole to know about me. But so yeah, this is my little tour through Facebook hell. And how does this relate to museums, right? Like, I've been reading mostly quotes from people who are speaking about indigenous knowledge, about internet culture. A lot of the early part of Bigger Than the Internet is really about the history of the internet, at least the way that I came to know it, as this place of free and open exchange where we were felt safe and welcome to share our information. My most personal journal entries on LiveJournal and Zanga and Asian Avenue and all of that. And then now where we are now, how does that relate to museums? Well, before we go on the break, I just wanted to, sort of just like take you into this little tunnel of Facebook Co into how our museums are using our information, and specifically how museums are starting to or have been defining their success and how well they're doing based on how much they're able to grab you on these platforms. So this is the Smithsonian fiscal year 2020. Go and find this little Facebook graph here. Okay. I'm definitely putting Smithsonian on blast, but at the same time, I'm putting all of us on blast because this is not unique to the Smithsonian, right? So there's a lot of numbers over here. So I just want to make a note that this was actually, this target was created prior to the pandemic. So our fiscal year begins in September the year before. So fiscal year begins September 2020 through the end of August 2020, something like that, September, October-ish, right? And so prior to the pandemic, these goals had been set. I know that there's like a lot that goes into this that I'm not privy to as a curator, but what's striking to me in this public document that you can very easily search by just Googling Smithsonian fiscal plan is that when we look at museum visits, we see a decrease in kind of people going to the museums, right? The 2020 target's a bit higher than the 2019 target, but it's still a steady decrease. Same with people being served by Smithsonian programs, education programs. From 2018, we have 11.8 down to 10.2 million, and kind of hovers around 10.5 million, but still is not an increase. Even Smithsonian websites, we see, again, a steady decrease in terms of the target, right? Of course, with what actually happened in 2020, we did get a lot more people over to our websites, but there was a plan to sort of, divest attention into our platforms. So the only category when it comes to engagement that increases is social media, and not just all social media, specifically Facebook and Twitter. Like, I don't know if this even includes the gram, right? Like, this is maybe just Facebook and Twitter, but we started off in 2017 with 6.3 up to 6.6, 7 million, and then 7.5. So, like a 500,000 increase. And this is all towards this Smithsonian grand plan, this strategic plan towards reaching 1 billion people, right? And the only way that possibly, as you can see with these numbers, when we're talking about reaching 1 billion people a year, it can only really happen online. And if we're divesting in our websites, then that means that it's mainly happening on Facebook and Twitter. So that's how it's connected to museums. And those are the stakes. So there's a lot there. We'll have a conversation about it, but it's also been almost an hour. So let's take a little break. I'll be back in like 3.5 minutes. All right. I hope you had a good break. Thanks y'all for sticking around. So what we're gonna do is actually we'll jump to a Cypher Q&A session. But before we do that, I just wanted to share, just for a couple of minutes, a couple of internet ethics pro tips, right? Because so much of my paper and so much of what I've talked about has been about kind of like the issues. And, I'm not trying to just kind of like say what's wrong and then not at least propose some ways out, right? So towards the end of my paper, I propose four things for us to consider that I hope that you join me in conversation. Like we're going to be doing more sessions and forums. I'm doing a talk with the Knight Foundation tomorrow around terms and services. So I'll share that in the link as well. But I'll just go through these real quick so we can have a conversation. So the first sort of pro tip I wanted to think about, and I invite all of you to join me in, is to think about a public serving code of ethics, right? And so, like the Smithsonian, we have a privacy statement, like, we have terms of use. Sort of pretty much all museums have this. Some of us even have to put it up on as links on our social media organizational accounts. These don't protect you, these protect them, right? And so what I'm interested in is also developing a code of ethics, commitments that institutions and museums will make, uh, towards stewarding a fair and equitable environment of community exchange, right? It's like the equivalent of like letting someone into a museum knowing that the ceiling's about to crash down on people, right? Like museums wouldn't do that in the same way, like if you know that Facebook is a dumpster fire, then maybe address it before inviting more people on with your posts. Um, that said, envision some terms and conditions directed towards social media platforms. Again, these terms and conditions, usually when it comes to the social media platforms, the museums, they just state that like, if you're on our Twitter account, then you're in Twitter's hands. If you're on our Facebook account, you're on Facebook's hands, right? But these, Twitter and Facebook is way different than it was when I first joined on. The terms of services and the way that they use my information is way different than it was when I first signed up. I think it's important for us, if we're going to be on these platforms on behalf of our institutions, that we read those terms and conditions, and at any point, if they run up against how we as institutions feel is a safe environment for information exchange, then that should be directed at these platforms. And at a certain point, it may mean mass divesting from these platforms if they don't abide. Similar to like the kind of power that advertisers are able to wield over these platforms. Third is a evacuation plan, and all I mean by that is like, maybe have a conversation with your staff where you imagine what it might be like if you didn't have a Facebook account. Like envision that as a thought exercise. Dare to think about what if your museum closed its Twitter account? What would that look like? How would you not just disappear yourself? What would become of the followers? What would become of the community that's been following you, and how would you steward them onto a better platform or a better forum for exchange? Is there a better forum for exchange, or is Facebook really is that really the best we can do? And then of course, all that can only happen if we communicate with our community. That may need to happen on Twitter, it may need to happen on the gram, but it can also happen in the museums. It can happen through the many different avenues that museums have, and that I hope we diversify, especially given that right now there's such a monopoly with these other platforms. So anyway, that's like a shit ton of rambling on my side. I really want to hear from you all and do a bit of a Q&A. So I guess I'll, to the organizers, I'll stop sharing, and then I'll reshare if need be, but thank you, Scott. Thank you, both ASL interpreters, appreciate you.
Thank you, Adriel. This has been, I'm like furiously taking notes over here. So just wonderful, important, relevant, timely, topical issues that you're bringing up, and your list of resources and everyone that you're citing is so great. I hope we can build a community practice around the scholarship and activism around this continued. Okay, so we have about like 10 minutes, but until we have to go. But I understand if folks have to head out, but we do have just a 15-minute period for question and answers. So we have a couple in the question and answer box. And if you do have a question, please use this, the Q&A box, so that's easy for us to track. So I'm wondering if, we have a question here. Do you have any thoughts around just digital content? We're moving from, as we're seeing through the pandemic, and you touched on this, moving from on-site to in-person, on-site into the digital realm. Lots of digital content questions coming up around accessibility, around kind of permissions use for images, etc. Anything that you can share, anything that you've found in your research you could share around kind of best practices around that? And yeah, what are some ways that we can advocate for healthy and transparent digital use?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that. I would say that the first thing is like, Here's one of the most important things. And here I also want to shout out Kimberly Drew, who has been really advocating on behalf of people who work kind of behind the boards in social media accounts. Like oftentimes the people who run social media are the least empowered, least well paid people on staff, yet they are the front line when it comes to communication, right? And oftentimes, and we saw this like a year ago when all these organizations and companies were posting their statements, and then people in the comments were getting upset. Which it makes sense why people are upset when all of a sudden certain institutions or organizations that never ever said anything all of a sudden have these statements. I and a bunch of my homies who are all people of color were the ones who were writing this on that, like because our director made us, right? Like drop a one if you had to write a statement or contribute to one, right? And so it's like that's so much emotional labor. And it's also emotional labor to see this work that you really tried to write out, in the best way possible, be responded to by your own community in really harsh but necessary ways, right? And so I think that the point I'm trying to make with this is that when it comes to doing right by communities on the internet, it can't just be the social media coordinators. It just can't just be the digital curators or the the interns or the volunteers or the folks the millennials, right? I have a whole section in my paper called Resident Millennial about sort of like what it was like as a millennial being a curator at the Smithsonian, but they were just like, here, take the Twitter, right? And so I think it's important for those of you who are working in museum staffs and you're not the ones who's logged into your organization's Twitter account, think about who is and how can you support them in having a more holistic conversation as high up as you can, ideally with your director included in because these platforms are really in a lot of ways the main artery for communication, and the stakes that these institutions put into these platforms don't necessarily reflect that. I think that there's a lot in that question. I guess the other thing that I would say is I learn a lot by diversifying my conversations. So I'm not just talking to museum folks, right? So yeah, I go to museums on the web, I go to MCN and these like museum tech conferences, but I also read about technologists. I quote in my paper Ibn Moglin and Jaron Lanier and folks who were like at the beginning of the internet and have warned us for years and decades about the things that are happening right now. And then I guess lastly, I think about stewardship of information. And with that, I really look to like, the free software movement, open source, folks in the open source movements. I think about like, I've collaborated with people in like Wikimedia and WikiCommons organizations. These are all folks who are, really experienced when it comes to stewarding information in a democratic fashion.
I love that. Yeah, I was trying to look as you were talking, but there are some resources around, Creative Commons, fair use, public domain, as a way to kind of shape what you were asking, Amber, in your question, like decolonizing the sense of ownership of the collection, even in its sharing of the image as, digital data. And so I'll try to find that and put that in the chat, but that's a great question. And I think very relevant. I'm wondering, let's see, I'm looking here. So this is a little bit of a kind of shift from what you were speaking to, but I'm wondering if you wanted to share any thoughts around, you spoke a bit about accountability with the kind of statements and, the folks who are put on the front lines for making these statements and then having to kind of respond or be responsive to audiences. Can you talk a little bit about accounts like Change the Museum, and kind of general museum policy around watching, engaging with personal social media accounts, and how are these kind of activist platforms on social media helping hold accountability, or is it creating a different kind of tension?
Both and. I mean, they're so important and there's definitely tension. you know. I mean, there's people on my ass right now about like sort of um, you know, sort of like what counts as, you know, ethical or unethical or conflict of interest. And so much of it isn't even written, you know, like you would think that with how long Twitter and Facebook has been around, that there are specific guidelines at major institutions about the use of our social media accounts, right? And specifically our personal ones or our websites. And but there isn't. And so for me, um, one thing is, you know, like read the rules, read the terms and conditions, know your rights, you know. And for me, I came from a background of freelance and as a full-time artist, so trust me, like reading the fine print and policy was not, it's not fun, but it was really empowering because I've learned that in a lot of institutions, the bureaucracy can be so thick that the answer is no, even if it's actually not no. It's just that there's like a fear of a fear of a fear that we might break the rules, right? But if you know the rules and you know what you're breaking and what you're not, and then you also know what rules will protect you and what rules you can advocate to shifting, right? I think that with every institution, it's a bit different in terms of like whether you can say this or that from your personal account or not. But yeah, definitely shout out to Change the Museum for the culture, all the folks organizing collective liberation. I think that it's important for us to band together and be a part of these. It really is the reason why, you know, I pulled this paper. Originally, it was going to be published with the Journal of Museum Education, but I pulled it so that I could share it on this forum. I felt like it would be a bit more in the spirit of the open knowledge exchange, you know, as opposed to kind of putting it behind a paywall. And so yeah, I encourage you to read the paper, and there's also like a link to like a guest book. It's just like basically another open Google Doc, but that's also a place where I would love to kind of continue these conversations and hear some suggestions and build on this knowledge, you know, like and especially, you know, kind of going back to when I was doing the decolonial shoutouts, one of the things I wanted to do that we didn't have time for in the session is to learn more about who are the people that I have not read yet and or written about. So I encourage you to hop onto that guest book and share some of that with me. And I think that as long as we're creating these forums, these petitions, these accounts where we can have these dialogues and exchange, we do see how you know, institutions change. Like yesterday, I just read the Whitney recognized the union. You know, that's huge. You know, and I think that that only happens because of the last biennial and the artists who pulled out. You know, like this incremental change that happens, and it does affect everything from the top down.
It's all of our work. It has to happen both bottom up and top down, and it's literally every tool in the toolbox at this point. So I think we have time for maybe just one more question. I'm trying to look through. Yeah, I really like this question about youth voices on museum platforms and just thinking about the next generation. You talked about the resident millennial. I'm already thinking about the resident Gen Zer. I mean, the ways in which museums are communicating are already kind of out of touch and out of date with like the ways that the upcoming generations are using digital platforms. So I don't know if you want to speak to the youth question at all and kind of generational change in the spirit of decolonial lens. We're thinking about 7 generations. Yeah, any thoughts on the youth?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, thinking about 7 generations is kind of wild in this time because, you know, like, you know, when we're thinking about 7 generations from an indigenous standpoint, we're really thinking about, you know, bloodlines and lineages, where now when we're thinking about generations, especially from like a tech and museum standpoint, we're thinking about marketing demographics, right? And that's different. Like none of these Gen Zers are my kids. That's not another generation, right? But what I will say is that, you know, these platforms, whether or not I choose to actively participate in them or not, like I do, and this is part of my practice as a curator of digital and emerging, is like to at least, to go on these platforms like TikTok, hearing how a lot of people my age and older are just kind of brushing it off the same way where people, like, y'all remember when Twitter came out, people were like, what, you're gonna write about your sandwich? And then when Instagram came out, they're like, what, you're gonna take a picture of your sandwich? So much more has happened. So much has already happened via TikTok, and yes, at the same time, like super shady privacy practices, but there, this is where you're seeing active survival and thriving of the internet at its heart, which is about, like doing one's best to sort of like hack the platform, right? I mean, you're not really hacking something if you're just sort of repurposing it. And these platforms have made it so difficult to actually go in and hack it. Like I remember when, even with MySpace, you had a whole HTML box and you could like build a whole website on your MySpace. You can't do that on Facebook. You can't do that on Instagram. Like I can't even share a link on Instagram, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't hack it in a different way by changing the culture in which this platform is being used, right? Like I loved Tumblr. Like I miss Tumblr hella much. Like Tumblr at its best was, like the best place to find artists, to get inspiration, to feel like I was seeing myself. I loved it, but now it's not here anymore, and so we have these other platforms. I really appreciate younger generations who are coming in with a certain kind of bravery that I don't have when it comes to the internet, because I was part of the generation that transitioned into the internet. I'm seeking the terminology for it, because in my paper I go off on the term digital native. Have fun with that with that section. But there is really I think that more important than sort of people who are born into adopting technology or born into the technologies that we had to adopt is people born into this climate of conversation, right? Like young people growing up, referring to their classmates in first grade as they, them, and having that vocabulary so that they don't have to feel like they're learning it like a foreign language the way that many of us older folks are, right? And so I think that this is all like reasons why I continue to lurk sometimes on some of these platforms, so that I can learn more. But I do see a lot of promise in it, and I think that the next stage will be us building our own platforms. We're not just waiting for someone to build our next Instagram, right? And building our own platforms in a way where we also are not only like creating our own version of Twitter or our own version of Instagram, but entire business models that also rethink, like the things that Twitter and Instagram have always thought that had to be the rules with them, right? Like Twitter and Instagram can't imagine beyond ad revenue. They can't imagine beyond corporate structures, but the internet can. And so I'm really excited about that.
Ooh, we could go on and on. I love this so much. I love that Stacey in the chat says, speaking of social media, if you're sharing, hashtag collective liberation. I guess we can flood social media, the algorithms to.
It feels kind of dirty.
I know, it feels.
The hashtag now.
I know, but
we are on it. I'm about to check my likes right after this. Try to see how many of y'all following me. I'm not really on Twitter so much anymore. Obviously, I'm not on Facebook. I'm still on Instagram. But like if I can just say one more thing that I feel like makes me optimistic is like, and also speaking to the like to the ableism piece, and accessibility, like, I joined Clubhouse like a lot of us, and have also sort of been a little bit lukewarm about it, especially because it seems to run so counter to a lot of the accessibility with, American Sign Language and closed captioning and things like that. But that said, one of the things I appreciated, by my friend Aja, who brought me onto the Clubhouse, was that it was all recognized that it was fleeting. No one was kind of building their nest in it the way that we maybe did with Facebook, right? We were all like, this is going to be tight for a hot minute, and then as soon as we start seeing, the corporations jumping in, as soon as we start seeing more ads, then we know it's time to go, you know. And I think especially for those of us who are either immigrants or come from families of immigrants, we understand this temporality, you know, like that's something that I feel like I was born into and that I know of, and that you know, makes me powerful in ways that I think if you're institutionalized, whether into an institution or onto a social media platform, and you can't seem to find a way out, you can look to folks like us who have left before, either out of necessity or out of desire, and we've landed on our feet. And if you choose to do that too, you have a community that will support you and will make sure you land on your feet too.
Excellent. That is a perfect place for us to land on our
Mhm.
feet. So we are going to say thank you to everyone. We're a little bit over time, but we really appreciate that everybody was able to come and participate today. We have another session coming up at 4 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Pacific, local contexts grounding Indigenous rights. And we also just want to remind people that we're really proud to be sharing the donations that are being collected with the Museum Workers Relief Fund. So anything that you donated, you know, in your registration fee is going to that. So again, thank you for coming, and please share the word, and we will see you again either later this afternoon or tomorrow, whenever you drop by again. So thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
And thank you, Adriel.
Thank you,
so much.
Adriel.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Stacey. Peace, y'all.